Hey there, good morning, HDFS 201 students. Sorry to miss seeing you in person, but I live on a really steep hill and it's super icy this morning because the snow that melted yesterday froze on the road. So I'm going to be giving you a short lecture slash discussion here online. I'm just going to do this in one take. It'll be pretty informal. You could imagine we're sitting here drinking coffee together. And then I will put a couple of online discussions on the Moodle shell and just go in there and participate. And actually having an online class at this point in the term is kind of a nice change, and it gives people who are more comfortable expressing themselves in writing rather than orally a chance to participate that way. And millennials and Gen Xers. But where are divorce rates increasing? In the baby boomer generation up here. So people that are 50 and older, so kind of the end of the Gen X generation and the beginning of the baby boomer generation are more likely to increase. Also, in terms of like true numbers each year, this link here, the data from the CDC, is a really good chart to look at. It's not all going to appear on your screen with this, but just to give you an idea. So if you look up here, you can see that you have about 7 marriages per year in 2016. And then if you go down here, about 3 divorces a year. So that's where we get the rate where people say about 50% of marriages end in divorce. Notice no set of data is perfect. Up here, it's excluding some of the data from Georgia and Louisiana. Down here, it has to exclude some of the data from California, Georgia, Hawaii, Indiana, Minnesota, and New Mexico. So it's very tricky getting this kind of data. Just think about this as, the rough numbers of what we have. Now, when we talk about divorce, there's sort of 2 layers at which I want you to be thinking about it. One is, how do societal factors affect divorce? Not just the likelihood of divorce, but how divorced families and children are treated and viewed. And then what are the individual factors? So that's more the interpersonal, what happened in that specific marriage or family. And they both play a part. And again, as we've talked about before, it's very easy to hone in on the personal factors in a particular relationship because we see ourselves as agency, having agency in our own lives, which we do have some, and we're less likely to pay attention to those bigger societal trends and factors that do affect us as well, although sometimes not as obviously. So that's going to be actually one of the discussion questions, to look at both of those. It's important to think about divorce now as opposed to divorce 50 or 60 years ago. The images, we still tend to hold on to those old images of divorce. And really, it's much more common now to have the amicable divorce, sometimes called the modern divorce. There was a picture in your online materials that I gave you of mom and dad's house, basically, mom's house here, dad's house here, and a little sidewalk in between. And this is not uncommon at all. So yeah, much more likely, and that's again, partly because marriage expectations have changed. Because people divorce for less, perhaps, dramatic or egregious reasons, it's also more likely that people can stay friends, which overall seems to be beneficial to children, which we'll talk about right now. So in terms of children, and this is probably the biggest thing that people care about and ask about when it comes to divorce, is what is the effect on children? And So here, just a few things to think about when we're thinking about divorce and children is custody needs to be determined. There's legal custody, and then there's physical custody. And these can be joint or they can be more one parent than another. But they can be different from one another. Like the legal custody could be shared, but the physical custody be in one home, or vice versa. So there's various ways that can play out. Remember that most family law is determined by state, not by federal law. So this is really important when we talk about divorce, because laws really vary state to state, and even counties can have particular rules of law. And of course, those can change over time. So it's really difficult to say. You may have had one experience in your life in one county in Oregon, and another person could have a completely or a very different experience even within Oregon. So remember that when you're talking about examples, there is variation. Contact, again, this is a big change that we have a lot of cultural lag around, that we haven't quite let go of the idea, realizing that really fathers specifically, or in general, the non-residential parent, tend to still be very involved in their children's lives. And we sort of have this idea of divorce where kids lose their parents, but that's just not as common anymore. And so that's an important thing to remember. And we don't really have as good studies yet on how children are affected when both parents stay in the child's picture, because that's kind of a newer trend. Economic, this is a huge one. Do divorces go up or down during recessions and depressions? It's appealing to think that they might go up because we think about money as being a stress on marriage. But actually, if you look at the trends, divorces tend to decrease during depression or recession, because two households are more expensive than one. So if you look at people trying to figure out if they're going to divorce, and it's a period of time when people are losing jobs or having income reduced in some way, actually less likely to divorce. In general, women tend to be more poor after divorce than do men. This is true whether they're residential, non-residential, custodial, etc. Women's income drop and men's income tends to stay the same or go up. We also have an increase of single fathers. And so of all single parent families, 16% tend to be fathers. So that's increasing. Okay, so then the other part, of course, is the psychosocial effects on children. The research on this is super complicated, and we could spend many class periods digging in really deep and looking at multiple studies. And those of you that are studying HDFS may well do that in some of your other classes. But here, again, we're looking at the bigger trends. How are most children affected? So in general, there tends to be what's called a crisis period. So for almost all children who go through divorce, 1 to 2 years where there's a lot of transitions. And that's probably the biggest thing, is the number of transitions. So if you just think about a child, maybe if they move out of their home, even part-time, okay, all the things that might change. They might change schools. They almost certainly will change bus routes or how they get to school. Their after-school care might change. Their neighbors and their neighborhood changes. That may affect some after school, like whether they go to the Boys and Girls Club or come home to a babysitter, or whether the parent can pick them up because maybe there's been a change in employment. Place of worship might change. So there's so many changes. And there might be multiple, like a parent might move to one temporary housing and then move to a second temporary housing or permanent housing. So this tends to be a lot of the stress that children experience. The other thing is we have what's called diminished parenting, and we haven't read our chapter on parenting yet, so this is a little harder to talk about here. So we'll talk more about parenting in a couple weeks, but in general, parents aren't as good at parenting during this 1 to 2 year period because they're also dealing with multiple transitions. They're trying to take care of many aspects of their life that are changing. They may be going through a very intensive legal battle. So all these things mean that parents don't parent as well as they did beforehand and tend to parent, better again. So long-term psychosocial effects, basically the best research we have is the majority of children resume normal development. This is so difficult to study, right? This is not something where you can put people in a lab and separate half of them to go through a divorce and have a control group that's exactly the same that doesn't go through divorce. Just not going to happen. So when we study this, we're just studying sort of really wide, variable circumstances. But what we think we know is the majority resume normal development. Kids that tend to have a more difficulty, some within adolescence seem to have a harder time. Also, if you see that gene-environment interaction, basically it says that a child that has any kind of genetic sensitivity to change is more likely to not continue to have normal development. That sounds sort of both very complicated and very simple, but it just basically means that if a child already has some difficulties with change, this is likely to be more disruptive. Okay, so let's see. Just looking back, this is something we looked at very early in the term, around week 3. Remember, if you want to go back, you can find the slideshow. I think it was the 3rd or 4th slideshow we did on family form and family function. Tends to be very tempting to think of divorced families as broken and therefore not functional. And what I really want you to do here is do your best to separate those. The reason is the more we as a society consider children to be broken or coming from broken homes, the more likely we are to harm them or to see them as having a deficit. So if we can look at at families with their function as opposed to their form, and it's when they're not functioning well, regardless of form, that we want to help them, right? And in that case, it's not that we want to label them. We want to help families, and in particular, help children to have better circumstances. So just think back on that and think about how it's possible that because we view divorced families as somehow insufficient, we therefore can put more harm on children who we then view as having some kind of deficit because of the form of family they live in. We don't want to do that, is basically the message here. Okay, so now just a couple things about repartnering and remarriages. This is kind of interesting. Basically, now the first thing is, the first bullet here basically says people who've been married once and divorced are now more likely to cohabitate than to remarry. Used to be remarrying was more common. Now it's more common to cohabitate. But if we look at remarriage as a piece of the pie of all marriages, that's actually increasing. Now, why is that? Now, remember we talked about last week, basically marriage overall is declining. So as marriage overall is declining, even though remarriage is also declining, it's not as declining at as rapid a rate. So this is a super interesting link, I'd definitely recommend going and looking at that. And that's where this chart is for, that basically shows you remarriage as a percentage of marriages. And last slide, back to thinking about children here and remarriage. One of the interesting pieces of data is that remarriage does not necessarily improve children's of divorce outcome. So in other words, there's a tendency to think that if a single parent were to remarry, it improves life for the child. That's not necessarily true, with the caveat of one thing. It may increase the income level, and that is shown to really help children of divorce or children of separation, is that because income level is probably the biggest factor that affects single parent families and leads to poorer outcomes for children. So remarrying can help in that way. But in other ways, it can make things more complicated, and that's why there's sort of this mixed result for children, whether they live in single-parent families versus remarriages. So if you look over at this chart on the left, the nuclear family day-to-day life. So here we're looking at what we like to think of as the typical American family, which of course is not the typical American family anymore. But if you think about that and all the factors that go into it, and this is just an idea here. So they have, the meals you have together, your spirituality or religion you have, time with friends, whatever privileges that family says children have, your medical and health care, the rules, how does that family sort of run, what are the expectations for children, what kinds of vacations do we go on, how do we spend our money, same thing here. Education, where do you go to school? What are the expectations of homework? Are parents involved? Family gatherings and holidays. So that's just kind of a snapshot there. Now, if we look over at remarriage, this shows us how this can become very complicated for children very quickly, because all of a sudden, all these things, and they show mother and stepfather. Of course, it doesn't have to be mother and stepfather, but it could be father and stepmother, mother and stepmother, etc. So the family still works to establish all these things, because these are important functions of the family, and especially things like, what are the rules in this household? What are the privileges in this household? The child is relearning those, because those have probably been renegotiated with the new step parent. And then also has those same things potentially in a second family, whether that family is a remarried family or not, whether it might be a single parent family over there. And on top of that, there might be court involvement. Maybe, maybe not. That will depend. Not all families will have that. So you can see right away, look at all the things that the child is now negotiating compared to in this nuclear family, which would be more similar to a single parent family. So a single parent family would be more likely, the child would be experiencing more likely this version of things. So not an easy answer one way or the other, but I think just gives you a sense of why it does increase the complexity for children when a parent remarries. All right, I'm going to stop there. I am getting ready to post a few forum questions in the week 8 block, and you can go on there to participate in discussions. You can see what my guidelines are for discussions, and I'll look forward to reading and discussing with you. I will try to hop on there at 10 and interact with you a little bit, and also to read your responses later. Have a great day. Bye.